When you think about your future, you know what calls to you. Meaningful work, happiness, growth, and sharing these values with others. But how will you find all of that? There are many paths forward, including one you may not have considered. The military provides countless opportunities to pursue your calling, where you can be part of something bigger than yourself, while still being yourself and having the future you want. You have a calling, we have an answer. Learn more at todaysmilitary.com.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
And I would walk 500 miles, and I would walk 500 more, just to be the one who walks 1,000 miles to fall down at your door.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, production stories, development stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything. I mean, they're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Trying really hard not to do snark. Try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. I cover 2 films in each regular episode of the podcast. So I'm just going to get on with the first of them, if that's all the same with you. I will set this up, as always, with a clip from the promotion for the film in question. I'll come to the story of it the other side of this.
We found something out here. Something only you might understand.
Oh my God.
I spent 20 years trying to get us ready for this. We used their technology to strengthen our planet. But it won't be enough.
I see them in my dreams. They're coming back.
Today you will once again be fighting for our freedom.
And that was a clip from the trailer for 2016's Independence Day: Resurgence, directed by Roland Emmerich. Screenplay in the end credited to Nicholas Wright, James A. Woods, Dean Devlin, Roland Emmerich and James Vanderbilt, based on story from Devlin, Emmerich, Wright and James A. Woods. Based on characters by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich, a cast led by Liam Hemsworth, Jeff Goldblum, Bill Pullman, Micah Monroe, Travis Tote, William Fichtner, Charlotte Gainsbourg and Judd Hirsch, all in the ensemble, a really extensive ensemble as well. And it did always seem inevitable that following the enormous success of 1996's Independence Day, written and produced by Dean Devlin, directed by Roland Emmerich, that there'd be some kind of sequel to it. In fact, I mean, the core creative team of it were very, very in demand. But Independence Day had sold notably off a trailer that, an infamous trailer that didn't have any of the lead characters in it. It sold off special effects. It did over $300 million at the US box office alone. This was a gigantic film in more than one sense. And so Independence Day 2, well, surely that was, the no-brainer, really. But Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich were busy because they'd gone straight from Independence Day onto the famous/infamous 1998 Godzilla movie that was made for Sony Pictures, and then continued doing work with Sony as well. In the year 2000, the pair made The Patriot with Mel Gibson, a very long film. But both Godzilla and The Patriot, whilst they didn't attract the nicest of reviews, they got decent box office money. So Devlin and Emmerich were still in demand. But in 2001 came the first tangible sign that we would be getting an Independence Day sequel, that Dean Devlin spoke to the outlet Sci-Fi Wire. And he confirmed that 2 films after making the original, Emmerich and he were turning their attention towards a follow-up. I think we finally found a story we wanted to tell, Devlin said, and so the pair of them were now investigating this. Now, it's worth noting that as much as they were at the start of the Universal Soldier franchise, for instance, which has gone on to have umpteen sequels, some of which really good as well. But at this point, both Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich had not made sequels. They were off doing all sorts of different films, and so a follow-up wasn't natural to them. But the whole idea of let's get as many of the original cast together was a good idea. However, Emmerich and Devlin also were juggling at this point in 2001 another science fiction project that was going by the name of The Hunt, and so that might be taking its place in the queue ahead of Independence Day 2. Now, I couldn't find an awful lot out about The Hunt specifically, apart from the fact that there was a planned Alien vs Predator film subtitled The Hunt. And I think, but don't hold me to it, that that's what Emmerich and Devlin were noodling with at that time. It didn't come to pass, and another year or two would pass along, and the atrocities of September the 11th, 2001 would also take place and influence kind of the story and the direction that they were wanting to take the film as they continued to develop it. But as Devlin would say, around that time, Roland and I are writing it, so hopefully it'll come out good, and if not, we'll bury it. Now, Devlin, in these early interviews about the film, did decline to discuss the story, but he was just hopeful about the project. He said, I think if we had a good script, everybody would want to come back. If the script's not good, they'll probably tell us to go our own way. But still, the pair of them kept making other films. Now, on the plus side, this meant that there were press junkets coming along, which meant a regular flow of questions from curious journalists. I know a lot of curious journalists about Independence Day 2. And also, the films were popular to varying degrees. 2004's The Day After Tomorrow, I continue to maintain, is an absolute hoot of a movie that I will come to on this podcast. 2008's 10,000 BC, I'd take fewer bullets for. However, the questions kept coming. In 2004, for instance, as the Day After Tomorrow was freezing its way into cinemas, Emmerich admitted to Sci-Fi Wire that the script that he and Devlin had been working on just wasn't working. He said, Dean and I met 2 or 3 times to figure out how to continue the story, and we couldn't. And so, he added that everything sounded like a repeat, and we don't want to do repeats. At least I don't want to. And so Emmerich said, we went to Fox, who'd already given us money. This wasn't known at the time that Fox had put development funding in, although I think most of us probably guessed. And Emmerich said, we said to them, guys, we have to give you your money back. And he argued with Fox. It's probably the first time that's happened. And so he added, we're very, very disappointed, but what can you do? And so they were waiting for the release of The Day After Tomorrow in May of 2004, also coming out via Fox, but at that point, it looked like Independence Day 2 was stuck in traffic, if happening at all. Things seemed to have come back slowly to life, though, when 10,000 BC came out in 2008, and I just broke the string of hits that Roland Emmerich had been enjoying. You go back right the way through. Emmerich and Devlin made Moon 44 together in 1990, but after that, the run was Universal Soldier in 92, Stargate in 94, Independence Day in 96, Godzilla in 98, 1998, The Patriot in 2000, The Day After Tomorrow in 2004. Whatever the critical response to all of those was, they all made money. 10,000 BC was the first one really to stumble to a degree. And so I always wonder with a filmmaker if at the point of a stumble they go back to something a little bit close to safer territory, which would have been an Independence Day sequel. However, Emmerich and Devlin were straight on to another natural disaster movie, the film 2012, which came out confusingly in 2009. And so it was around the point that came out and then that hit big. I mean, that hit really big as well, that the questions just kept coming, but also the answers were coming a little more tuned, because it was in 2009 that it was confirmed the plan wasn't just for one Independence Day sequel. Now they were looking at making two of them. We were going to get an Independence Day trilogy. Who did they think they were? George Lucas. And at this point, treatments had been written, so they knew what the story was roughly going to be. And so that development continued, took its place in the queue. Questions started to swirl about would everyone be coming back? But then Emmerich also took this opportunity to do a passion project, a lower budget film called Anonymous, that a little bit Shakespearean, that one, you might remember, that came out in 2011 and didn't really interest an awful lot of people. And so straight after that, he was back into the world of blockbusters. In 2013, he would release the film White House Down, which is a gloriously entertaining action movie, which I covered before on this podcast. But in the midst of the release of Anonymous and White House Down, as one film was out, the other was being prepped. I think it was around 2012 that Emmerich gave an interview to Latino Review that said there was now a different stumbling block for the Independence Day follow-ups. And Emmerich said, Dean Devlin and I are still set to make a sequel because we found some sort of idea and we approached Fox, and Fox still hasn't quite figured out how to incorporate Dean's and my deal and Will Smith's deal. And Will wants to do it in some sort of a package that they can live with. So this was the first open acknowledgement that I could find that Will Smith's financial package for two Independence Day follow-ups was a problem. This was also the first time it was even vaguely mooted that Independence Day 2 would happen without its lead from the earlier film, without Will Smith in it. Now, again, 1996's Independence Day did not sell off Will Smith's name. His name is not on the poster. His image is not on the poster. That notwithstanding, it was one of the films that rocket-fueled his career, and it seemed odd that they would do a second film without the lead of the first film. However, the expense of these movies was clearly going to be a problem. That if we look at where Hollywood was in 2012, the scale of movies had gone up. We'd seen movies cross $1 billion at the box office. We'd had the first Avengers film. We'd had The Dark Knight. That the monetary expectation had gone up. And so there was no danger anywhere along the lines of any of the core cast or crew cutting some kind of deal here, that this was not a small independent movie a la Anonymous, or at least Anonymous, a much smaller movie where people would be more tempted to cut their upfront fee just to get it made. Fox was clearly going to make Independence Day 2. Fox at this point was owned by Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, not short of a few bob, and not really a massive list of people who want to do him a financial favour either. So if Fox now wanted to pursue the Independence Day sequel idea that Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin had presented, the checkbook was going to have to come out. Devlin wasn't going to be cheap. Emmerich wasn't going to be cheap. Will Smith absolutely was not going to be cheap. And it was a case of the studio had a really big decision to make. Fox suggested for the first time around this point that why not do this without Will Smith? That would straight away cut, $50 million off the upfront price of making these two massive science fiction blockbusters. But neither Emmerich nor Devlin were keen on that. They wanted Will Smith in this film. And so move forward to the year 2012, not the film 2012. The conversation was now, let's make the two films back to back. There's an economy of scale to making them back to back. Dean Devlin was suggesting that both scripts would be ready for the end of 2012. Will Smith was in negotiations. The $50 million asking price had come out in the trade press. Fox still a little bit coy on it all. MovieWeb, meanwhile, filled in a little bit of the detail that the rumour was they were looking to do something with Independence Day 2 and 3, akin to Back to the Future 2 and 3, in that the stories would link together to some degree, that there'd be a cliffhanger potentially in the middle of them. Film them back to back, get them out within a year of each other, sit back, count the change, let's all go on holiday. Will Smith, meanwhile, in the midst of this, signed up for a different science fiction project for M. Night Shyamalan, the film that became After Earth. It wasn't originally known as After Earth. That was expected to be a big success. Will Smith's fee for that was on the expensive side as well. And so it was still not a definite he was either in or out of Independence Day. And also the titles of these sequels was mooted around this point. ID Forever Part 1 and ID Forever Part 2. It sounds like you're going buying cheap booze, doesn't it? So, this was still moving. White House Down had to be finished and made, and Emmerich duly did that. He works fast on blockbuster films. He can turn them round relatively quickly. I mean, go back to that list I showed you before. You go 2-year gap between Independence Day and Godzilla is quite something. To then have a 2-year gap to The Patriot, quite something. And so he was straight into White House Down, which found itself in a race with Olympus Has Fallen, which I've covered those two on the same podcast episode. And so it was when he was doing interviews for White House Down that he talked to Entertainment Weekly in March of 2013. And he said at this point the humans knew that one day the aliens would come back. He was clearly warming to the idea of the new Independence Day film. 2 scripts had indeed been completed at this point. Lots of writers had input, but the core of it was said to have been put together by Devlin and Emmerich, who then passed it over to White House Down writer James Vanderbilt, who gave it a pass as well. But I want to acknowledge that other writers were credited on the screenplay for this when the final arbitration was done. Emmerich, meanwhile, filled in a few more details in that Entertainment Weekly interview. He said that they know that the only way you can really travel in space is through wormholes. So for the aliens, it could take 2 or 3 weeks, but for us, that's 20 or 25 years. I wonder if Christopher Nolan had a look at this proposed screenplay when he went to make Interstellar. Stranger things, right? Now, at this point in 2013, Bill Pullman was confirmed to be back. It wasn't a case that the other cast were reticent to return, but Will Smith, again, just the whole, it's easy to forget just what a saga this turned out to be. Will he be in it? Won't he be in it? It got to the point where they were developing two different parallel ways forward. A screenplay that had Will Smith's character in the film, a screenplay that introduced a relative of Will Smith's character in case he eventually turned it down. And it came to light in 2013. It would be the idea, have this cliffhanger at the end of the first film and then take things from there. So Vanderbilt was working on these different drafts, and Fox at this point had got itself to a position where it was ready to go on the movies. The stumbling block was fairly clear. It was a casting stumbling block. And it had announced a summer 2015 release date, but as it got to the end of 2013, it just got to buy itself a bit of wiggle room. And so it moved the release to the July the 4th weekend in 2016. Now, this is notable as well because this was 20 years after the release of the original, so it could have a lot of fun with that. But it seemed fairly definite now that 20th Century Fox was going to press ahead with this sequel. This was it. This was going to happen. What would Will Smith do? In February 2014, we found out he opted to go and make the film Suicide Squad instead for Warner Brothers and for director David Ayer. And he turned down Independence Day 2. The schedules were incompatible with each other, whether Smith ultimately wanted to make the Independence Day sequel or not. I went through his memoir to see if I can find any mention of his thoughts on this, and there just weren't any in there. And so it was at a point where Fox was willing to do a deal with Smith to appear in the film, But Smith opted to go elsewhere. He was now in Suicide Squad, and at least it cleared the runway for Independence Day 2 to go forward. Fox had decided to streamline this down to just the one film up front. The idea of doing them back to back at this stage, it kind of veered away from an enormous upfront investment to commit to doing two films of this scale at once. Just to give you an idea of what kind of scale we're talking about, Independence Day Resurgence box office, its production budget would be $165 million. Now, the original Independence Day had cost the studio $75 million. That was not on the cheap side. $165 million, a point where Fox was having some ups and downs at the box office as well. That was a sizable investment. The thought that the studio would pay up front or commit up front to over $300 million to get two of them, that was kind of pushing things a little bit. It's worth noting that back in February 2014, there was still an olive branch in case Will Smith changed his mind. That Deadline wrote, I don't believe that Smith has had the final conversation yet with Roland Emmerich, but that will likely happen shortly. I was told not to set this in stone because Smith has been back and forth before on whether to make the movie. That's interesting in itself. Though I hear he's pretty much decided. He was pretty much decided. While all that was going on, Roland Emmerich squeezed in another production as well, another passion project, the drama Stonewall, which he'd been trying to make for some time. And then he would get that shot ready for release in 2015. By the time Stonewall made it into cinemas, Emmerich was on the set at last of the long awaited Independence Day sequel. So then, the casting came together. The rest of the casting at least came together. I mean, for us on the outside, the signs that this was really going to happen came with a flurry of casting announcements between January and March 2015. Vivica A. Fox was going to come back, Bill Pullman coming back, Jeff Goldblum coming back, Jesse Usher coming in to play Will Smith's relative in the film. There's Liam Hemsworth, he's signing on the dotted line. Micah Monroe signing on the dotted line. Charlotte Gainsbourg as well, she was coming aboard. And this extensive cast, huge cast for the film. Brent Spiner in there, it should be in every film, right? Also, you go further and further down. William Fichtner's an interesting one. There's McKenna Grace taking an early role in here. The thing with William Fichtner, actually, is he was cast in May of 2015, and even though talk was very firmly of doing one Independence Day sequel at this point, Deadline noted that when he was cast in his role in the film, it was only going to be a very, very small part in the movie, but the idea was make it bigger should the world open up to more films. The President of the United States this time would be Celia Ward. Do you remember Celia Ward in The Fugitive? She would come on, and speeches would need to be made. And in April of 2015, April the 20th actually, 2015, production finally began on Independence Day 2, as it was still known. Now, this a global disaster movie, very much in Roland Emmerich's wheelhouse. He knew the drill. You destroy very recognisable landmarks, although given how many he destroyed in the first film, it was tricky to destroy too many more of them. They had to shake that up just a little bit. There were territories that they were very reluctant to be destructive towards because that would hurt global box office and cause political problems that they didn't particularly want to walk into. Most of the film was shot in the New Mexico area, and that was because that's where they could get a very, very generous tax credit, and also it would work for the locations for what Emmerich wanted to put on screen. The movie also went to Dubai, it came to the UK, it went to Singapore. Marcus Forderer came in as director of photography on the film, and he talked to the ASC on its website about the film and about what Emmerich was going for, because he said for Resurgence, as it would become known, not told you that yet, Roland wanted a really dark look. And he says, usually you fight as a cinematographer to make a movie interesting and darker, and the director will just say, I want to see the performance, I want to see their faces. No such conversation here. Roland would be like darker until there was almost no light hitting the sensor. And as Forderer said, the way to get away with that is to make sure you have the right kind of eye light. Then you can go dark and still be connected with the characters. He shot this in very high resolution as well, on digital, on 4K and 6K anamorphic, on Red Epic Dragon cameras, of which I do not have one. And most of the film was going to be digital. I'll come to that shortly. Because in June of 2015, when we were 5-6 weeks into the shoot, that's when 20th Century Fox announced that Independence Day 2 was now going to be called Independence Day: Resurgence, as one critic, not particularly politely, ultimately put it, Independence Day: Detergent. Quite funny, bit snarky, so I'll move away from that. But this was now going to be called Resurgence. The absence of Will Smith was covered and was mentioned in the film. I mean, we get a visual gag as well as a mention to the fate of his character, which I won't spoil here. And then Emmerich this time, I mean, it's worth remembering that with the first Independence Day movie, computers were not anywhere near as advanced, and there was a lot of practical miniatures work that was being done. Here, though, the computers had been evolving, and Emmerich would lean far more towards computer-generated visual effects. There would be tiny bits of miniatures work done on set, but I mean, the amount of miniatures that they were doing, nowhere near on the same scale. The Independence Day Resurgence instead was going to have around 2,000 digital effect shots that were going to be used to bring the alien invasion back to the screen. A lot of green screen material was shot, obviously. There was some tangible reference stuff with some of the practical bits, but that's not where the bulk of the work was going. Filming wrapped up on August the 22nd, 2015. That was the end of principal photography. It gave Emmerich the best part of a year to fashion the final cut of the movie and to get those visual effect shots completed as well. There was some pickup work that was done in early 2016. Some fresh material was shot. That was done in and around the Los Angeles area. But by then as well, the first trailer for Independence Day: Resurgence had hit. That landed just before Christmas 2015. Awareness of the movie was now very much on the up, and Fox was positioning it to be one of the very big films of the summer of 2016. This was the kind of blockbuster any studio would have wanted, and confidence was building. Built into the promotion of the film, obviously what they couldn't do this time was the iconic movie trailer that the first film sold so heavily off, of a massive spaceship and the destruction of the White House as well. And so the promotions lent into the nostalgia of it all a little bit, but it couldn't quite repeat the same trick. However, one of my favourite parts of the promotion of this was 20th Century Fox in the UK at this point had inked a deal with Manchester United Football Club. And what this meant was players from Manchester United, which at that point was, I'm not getting into football, I'm just going to point this out, at that point was slightly more successful than it has been in recent years, were drafted in to be edited into promotions for a collection of 20th Century Fox films. They turn up in a promo for X-Men Apocalypse, for instance. And, well, I would set your cringe levels a little bit. I'll give you a little bit of a taster of just what this sounded like.
This is a day of history in the making as Legacy Squadron is about to take to the skies.
You guys are footballers. What makes you think you could take on an alien army?
We won 20 league titles and 12 FA Cups.
4 League Cups and 20 Community Shields.
I'm fairly certain we can handle a few out-of-towners.
This is it. Everything we've prepared for. Strike hard, strike fast. Watch each other's backs out there. Remember, we're a team. Wayne, you're on point.
Game on, lads!
Martha, Young.
That was former Birmingham City Football Club manager Wayne Rooney there just at the end. The rest of the promotion, the word of mouth was just building up, and it was a case of, well, is the film going to be any good? And again, it's worth noting that the critical response to the original film, even though some loved it, was fairly tepid. This was a movie that sold heavily off audience response to it. And so Fox set its premiere for June the 20th, 2016 in the US. The release date just moved forward to June the 24th as well. Went before critics, and the response was, well, just not great, really. That even taking into account that there tends to be a little bit of a snootiness towards massive blockbuster films, the response here was just not particularly good as well. That I think, as one person put it, it might be dumb, but it's just not dumb fun. It's boring. It's doing the same things, and the novelty's gone, and now there's a lot of characters. It just wasn't quite working the same way. Now, I should point out, some people really loved it. Some people praised the fact that it was just daft and just a B movie on a massive, massive scale. But of course, the ultimate arbiter of it all would be the audience. Would an audience turn up to watch an Independence Day sequel? So let's give some context to how this sat. The original Independence Day movie had an opening weekend in the US of $50 million. Now, that was $50 million in 1996 money as well. It wasn't the biggest opening of all time ever or anything like that. It was still on the absolutely massive side. In the case of Independence Day Resurgence, its opening weekend, well, it just fell short of that. It opened with a weekend of $41 million. And that was nearly 20% down on the original movie, plus 20 years of inflation as well to take into account. It didn't even get to number one at the box office either. That on its opening weekend, it was in second place to Disney and Pixar's Finding Dory, which was on its second weekend of release. Finding Dory banked $72 million on its second weekend. Independence Day : Resurgence, $41 million. And other films that were opening, The Shallows opened with $16.8 million and sat in fourth place. Free State of Jones opened with $7.5 million, sat in sixth place. Hanging around the chart, Central Intelligence on its second weekend, $18 million. Now You See Me 2 was around. The Conjuring 2 was around. X-Men Apocalypse, also promoted by Manchester United players, was just about lingering in the top 10, along with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Out of the Shadows and the Warcraft movie. The second weekend saw Independence Day Resurgence, lose 60% of its takings of the July the 1st to the 3rd weekend. The key weekend, really. Independence Day was down to fifth place, $16.7 million, as some big hitters came along. The Legend of Tarzan from Warner Brothers, from Harry Potter director David Yates, $38 million. The Purge Election Year, $31 million. The BFG from Steven Spielberg, $18.7 million. Still at the top, Finding Dory, $41 million on its third weekend. Did in its third weekend what Resurgence did in its first. And Independence Day Resurgence continued to drop. By the time it had completed its US box office run, no $300 million gross here. Instead, its US gross was $103 million. Its non-US gross was $286 million. The total, $389 million, less than half the total takings of the original Independence Day movie. And the feeling was, any chance you had there of Independence Day 3, well, it just wasn't going to happen. That said, there was still talk of it. I mean, in June 2016, Emmerich was telling Empire about how Independence Day 3 would be set maybe a year or two later, not 20 years on, so they could keep the same group of characters, keep the group together. He was saying he would definitely direct it. He'd done one sequel now, he would look to do another. The film would never happen. In fact, Emmerich at one point was talking about directing sequels to Moonfall from 2022. Those haven't happened yet, sadly, either at the moment. I will keep you posted on those. And in 2019, Emmerich, while promoting the independently funded $100 million movie Midway, was a little more open about what had gone wrong with his Independence Day sequel. He said, "I just wanted to make a movie exactly like the first, but when Will Smith dropped away from the film, when the film was more advanced than people were letting on, Emmerich said, I should have stopped making the movie because we had a much better script. Then I had to really fast cobble another script together." He told that to an interview with Yahoo. Emmerich did ponder that when 20th Century Fox was sold to Disney, with Disney was talking about it was going to look to make big franchise sequels in 2024. As we sit here, Disney's finally made a new Planet of the Apes film and an Alien film. Last year there was a new Predator film. So Emmerich held out a possible hope of Independence Day 3. Yet of the big assets on the amongst Fox's blockbuster movies, Independence Day remains one that Disney has really elected not to touch. Emmerich has gone off to make make independently funded big films, Midway and Moonfall. But as we sit here in 2024, there's no sign of Emmerich's next movie. He's doing some TV stuff now. There's no sign of another Independence Day film. And that 1996 movie, in its own way, really, it just pretty much stands alone.
This episode is brought to you by Rakuten. If you're shopping while working, eating, or even listening to this podcast, then you know and love the thrill of the hunt. But are you getting the thrill of the best deals? Rakuten shoppers do. They get the brands they love with the most savings and cash back. And you can get it too. Start getting cash back at your favorite stores like Samsung, Expedia, and Sephora. And even stack sales on top of cash back. It's easy to use, and you get your cash back through PayPal or check. The idea is simple. Stores pay Rakuten for sending them shoppers, and Rakuten shares the money with you as cash back. Download the free Rakuten app and never miss a deal. Or go to Rakuten.com to start getting the most bang for your buck. That's RAKUTEN.
Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices before we get into the second half of the episode. Firstly, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it in ways other than lending it your ears, and I'm very, very grateful that you lend it your ears, there are a few ways you can do so. To financially support us, if you go to patreon.com/SimonBrew, put some money in the pot there. You get in return the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free as well, and you find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes too. Costing you absolutely nothing is to go to your podcast home of choice and subscribe to the podcast, and likewise while you're there too, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review. Loads of people have done those two things for me and it makes a difference, particularly when you're a small independent podcast without a massive marketing budget or anything like that. It's stuff like this that really does help a podcast bubble up. Thank you so much to everyone who's had my back on that. A couple of other things as well. I've got print magazines. I've just put issue 50 of Film Stories magazine up for pre-order. I can't wait to tell you who's on the cover of that. Likewise, Film Junior, the new issue of that, is about to go live as well. You can find all of our print magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk, and you will also find at that shop our UK exclusive Blu-rays of No Way Out and Bull Durham as well. And then if you're in London on the 16th of May 2024, we're having a celebration of Film Stories issue 50 in the form of one of our pub quizzes. There will be prizes, there will be drinks, there will be a copy of the magazine as well. All the details at store.filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to move to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of the podcast, and well, this one's got a bit more of a musical leaning to it. Let me play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
I'm on my way from misery to happiness today. Going to propose to Liz.
It was one night. It was 25 years ago, Jane.
We were married, Rap. I want you to get out of my sight.
It's over and done with, it's over and done with. It's over and done with, it's over and done with.
What are you doing with yourself? You working?
Yeah, in a call centre.
And I thought I had it bad.
Will you do me the honour of becoming my wife?
This is about me and you. If something happens, I want to know if you come with me.
Or what?
That's us finished.
We nearly died, Ali. Why would you want to go back?
Because they wanted me!
What if what you want is going to hurt other people?
You got to make your own mind up about what's right for you.
And that was a clip from the 2013 movie Sunshine on Leith, directed by Dexter Fletcher, written by Stephen Greenhorn, based on his stage show, starring Peter Mullen, Jane Horrocks, George Mackay, Antonia Thomas, Freya Maber and Kevin Guthrie amongst its ensemble. Jason Fleming in there, as he is with pretty much every Dexter Fletcher movie as well. Now, Dexter Fletcher's come up a couple of times on this podcast in the previously for his Eddie the Eagle movie. He's been on to talk about Rocket Man. He's been a guest a couple of times too. This is really the overlooked gem, as far as I'm concerned, in the Dexter Fletcher collection. It's his second film as director after 2011's Wild Bill, but the story of it goes back a little bit further, inevitably to a pair of brothers who record music under the name The Proclaimers. Now, The Proclaimers, whose most popular song is 500 Miles, had spent a long time building up their songbook. This is not a podcast about The Proclaimers, but nonetheless, I should acknowledge that they put out an awful lot of song, which people really had heard or were very knowledgeable about 3 or 4 of them. But it was a writer by the name of Stephen Greenhorn who thought about turning their work into a musical production on the stage. Now, the 2000s, when he was doing this, it was 2007 it ultimately debuted. Well, this was the era of the jukebox musical that ABBA's songbook had made Mamma Mia into a huge hit, first debuting at the end of the 1990s and becoming a massive hit throughout the decade. Also turned into, by this stage, it was just about to be turned into a feature film. A sequel would follow to that, which I've covered before on this podcast as well. There was also the Queen musical, We Will Rock You, and all of a sudden the songbook of lots and lots of recording artists just became viable to turn into stage shows. Now, what Stephen Greenhorn saw was something a little bit different. So he approached the Proclaimers about using their music, and they were very open about the fact, don't know anything about stage shows, you can use the music, don't mess it up. And so Greenhorn fashioned a show that debuted to really strong reviews at Dundee Rep in 2007. Now, DNA Films has amongst its principal people producers Andrew MacDonald and Alan Wright, and the pair of them, Andrew MacDonald had produced Trainspotting, that was up until this point the last film that he'd made in Scotland, and soon the pair were thinking, well, there might be something in this for the screen as well, that it attracted some funding from the BFI Film Fund in the UK and also from Creative Scotland, and so some development work got underway, and Stephen Greenhorn set about adapting his stage play for the screen. Now, what the producers realised really was what they needed was someone from the outside then to take a look, that you got people heavily involved in the stage production or invested in it to some degree who were fashioning the script, but when it came to a filmmaker, well, who were you going to pick? In an interview with Sunday Times Culture magazine, Dexter Fletcher was admitted it was quite flattering, some of the stuff that he was sent to direct after he'd broken through as a director with Wild Bill. Dexter Fletcher, of course, an extensive acting career. He was alongside John Pertwee as a child in Green Cross Code commercials in the UK, turned up in Bugsy Malone as a very young performer, hosted the TV show Games Master for a series over here, had some highs, had some lows, had broken into directing, and then when Wild Bill did well and got good notices as well, he was being sent scripts. He was being sent scripts about football hooligans, about kitchen sink dramas. He was being sent scripts about East End gangsters as well. And he said it was all flattering, but I trusted my instinct and my heart to wait until something came along where I went, I have no idea how I do this, but these people are taking me seriously. Well, that's where DNA Films came in and an approach came in, and Fletcher talked in an interview or two about how he got involved really in early 2012, that he got sent the script of the stage show to have a look at, but also he would be candid about the fact he wasn't overly familiar with the music of the Proclaimers. He certainly knew it, but he wouldn't describe himself as a fan, and once you're going 6 tracks down into the Proclaimer songbook, that's where his knowledge just started to fade a little bit. But what this meant was he could approach it a little bit cold, really. And so even when he was going through the script that had been written, he would go through the songs. There were 13, I think, songs in the end that ended up in the film. But he would read the lyrics of the songs. And what that would allow him to do was see how those lyrics worked within the context of the story of the film and the characters of the film as well. And working alongside Stephen Greenhorn could fashion a screenplay with which he could get behind. This was fulfilling his criteria. It was a film that he didn't, in his heart of hearts, know how to do, that was going to push him out of his comfort zone. But also, he found that this wasn't just a straight jukebox musical, that there was purpose to wrapping the songs into the story that they wanted to tell, and it was holding water. So at that point, things were going to come together really rather quickly. And in fact, in terms of casting, the core piece of casting in the first instance for Dexter Fletcher and the team, once he'd signed on as director, were Jane Horrocks and Peter Mullen in 2 of the lead roles. They were first on the casting list, and they sent the script out to the pair of them at roughly the same time, went to the agents, and then there was a 48-hour wait to see how both Horrocks and Mullen responded to the material. Now, Jane Horrocks had done West End musicals before. She's an experienced singer. Anyone who saw Little Voice knows what a terrific voice she got. Peter Mullen, let's just say less experience with singing, but some gravitas in there as well. And so it just felt like the right combination to head up the ensemble. What Fletcher saw in those two was they were the nucleus of the family in the film, and if they said yes, he could kind of cast it outwards from there, and they did indeed say yes. Then it was the opportunity, really, because they got those two people in place who had some degree of profile already, that they could go to relative unknowns for the rest of the roles. They could open the auditions up, and exactly what they did. And so as part and parcel of the auditions, a whole group of performers would come in and they would sing the Proclaimers' song Sunshine on Leith as part of the audition. And so they were able to bring in people who weren't necessarily as experienced on the big screen. That people like Kevin Guthrie came in, and Antonia Thomas and Freya Mavor were in. Also, what a coup to get George Mackay at the point they did in his career. This was a couple of years before he made the film Pride, which was one of those that really put him on the map. But also he was in the midst of making 3 films back to back once he got the job in Sunshine on Leith, and I'll come to those very, very shortly. His first big screen appearance was in 2003 Peter Pan film, but here he was starting to land big screen roles again as an older performer. The whole thing, as Dexter Fletcher went in as well, was my first jumping off point. He told this to the BBC, was to see if these people were real and were the songs telling their story. And he liked the idea that the writer of the play was Scottish. The songs are about Scotland. It's set in Edinburgh, and he's sort of the outsider. So he, as an English director, said, I tried to let the film do its own work in terms of being Scottish. I was very mindful, he said, of trying not to create an outsider's point of view, of trying too hard to be Scottish. He just wanted this to feel a little bit more natural and just to work as it was. After some rehearsal work then, an announcement went onto the Proclaimers website on November the 6th actually of 2012. It is right in front of my eyes here, and it confirmed that Sunshine on Leith was to start shooting in Edinburgh on that day. That DNA and Black Camel Pictures were behind it, and the idea was that the film would shoot for 6 weeks in and around the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow in Scotland. This confirmed the full cast of the film. It had lots of upbeat quotes, and it also had the Proclaimers themselves. Really just, Craig and Charlie Reid, the Proclaimers, said, we're really happy to see the musical being transformed into a film. He said the musical has a brilliant storyline and a great cast alongside a great wealth of talent behind the cameras. Our very best wishes go to all involved. And they were, to a degree, quite hands-off, really, with the film. That's not to say they're not in it. They are in it. That Charlie and Craig Reid came along on set and shot a small cameo in the movie that Dexter Fletcher would admit in Q&As he had an awful lot of fun with, and it's a really nice little moment in the film as well. The movie was shooting in Scotland, that the exteriors were done in Edinburgh and Glasgow, but the vast bulk of the interior work done in Glasgow. The film's set in Edinburgh though, but this was a low-budget film. And so, as Dexter Fletcher explained, that a lot of the crew were based in Glasgow, and they knew that if they did a lot of the work there, one of the savings they could make is basically transporting people from one city to another. That's how much money they had available to them, that they had to be really frugal about stuff like this. It will cut travel and accommodation costs as well. And the impact of that really was, if you are a resident of Glasgow or Edinburgh, you might notice, for instance, there's a moment in the film where characters get into a cab in Glasgow and they ask to go somewhere in Edinburgh, a cab ride just shy of about 100 miles. So Lord knows what the cost of that was, but that's a bit of filmmaking, just a bit of filmmaking shorthand for you. Fletcher would say that the toughest scene to shoot concerned Misty Blue, that particular song that was shot on Carlton Hill of a young couple singing a song to each other. And he wanted to shoot this particular musical number of this couple coming together in one continual long shot with the backdrop of Edinburgh behind them. This was well ahead of La La Land, which would do something in Los Angeles, of course, a couple of years later. And so they put down a long track, they rehearsed rehearsed the shot. They got everything ready. What they hadn't taken into account was they were going to be on top of a hill overlooking Edinburgh in November. That at the point the coats came off, the actors were absolutely freezing, and they're supposed to be gazing lovingly into each other's eyes, and yet they're wearing clothes which are a bit more appropriate to spring and summer in the cold of Edinburgh in the winter, and having to convincingly put across the fact that actually they're falling for each other and they're not freezing their nether regions off. The pace of a low-budget film as well, or at very least a very modestly budgeted film that needed to get a lot of material in the can, meant that, I mean, poor Antonia Thomas had a bit of a moment in the movie herself, because she was taken out by the producer one night and they went to have oysters at dinner. She got food poisoning as a result of that, had 2 hours sleep, and then had to come in the following day. They didn't have the opportunity to delay this, came in the following day to do a big musical number, and again looked like she's fully in the scene and not wanting to crawl into bed and basically throw up. There was a really good musical number in the film as well that takes place in a pub, and Dexter Fletcher talks about this again in Q&As that you can find online, of just what a tough one that was to shoot, because a location shoot as well, but also in a very, very tight space with a lot of people. And as much as it looks like it's really random and there's lots of jumping around in the sequence concerned, the choreography work in advance of that had to be really, really intense in order just to be able to capture the material that they needed. They did not, I mean, when Dexter Fletcher would come to make Rocket Man several years later, his next musical movie, he would have, 6-8 weeks of rehearsal and a lot more space to make it. In the case of Sunshine on Leith, they were putting on big musical sequences in a film in spaces that, it would be fair to say, were not built for big musical sequences. Fletcher did shoot a pretty indoors ending for the movie as well. He used people who were there on the day to kind of bulk it out, and so there's quite a lot of non-actors in the ending that he shot. He was shooting bits of footage for the finale as they'd gone along as well, but in early 2013, Sunshine on Leith was in the can. They could take it into post-production and take a look at the material that they gathered, and it was then that they realised that the ending really wasn't quite hitting the mark. That as much as people, the financiers really were impressed with the film, and they felt, I mean, DNA Films felt like they had a commercial movie here, that this could really, really work. But it was building up to an ending that was surprisingly small, that it took the most well-known song of the Proclaimers and built an impressive musical number, but could they do something else with it? And so there was a question put to Fletcher about, if you had more money, would you go back and reshoot the ending and do a bigger payoff for the audience? And he was a bit reluctant to do it. He talked to the Sunday Times Culture magazine, and he said, my wife was, why are you resistant? And he said, it's not that I'm resistant, I just feel like I failed. And she just said to him, just shut up, basically. And as Fletcher admits, ran the article, he may have been an actor for 40 years, but directing is still a learning curve. Although in the end, he realised he was just being foolish. He said there was an incredible opportunity to elevate, and I had to grab it. How often do you get the chance to shoot an extra week? He said that never would have happened on Wild Bill. And yet the money was being put together to allow him to shoot a much bigger ending on the streets of Edinburgh. Now, he would have a week of shooting, of a week of production, of which 3 days of that would be shooting. There would be, this was in post-production, they did go off and do these extra days of reshoots. They had 400 extras planned on the day for the big dance number that was now going to end the film. But what they discovered was lots of people were watching the movie being shot, and so they reckon, I mean, Dexter Fletcher reckons another 100 or 2 were joining in by the time they actually came to shoot, because, I mean, it was a lot of rehearsal. I mean, day one was just teaching all the people the dance that they needed to do. He would describe this as an incredibly stressful day, and having to keep everyone's energy and enthusiasm levels going on that day was particularly challenging. And it was over the second and third days that they could actually shoot that particular particular sequence. It turned out, though, that the decision to change the ending of it, and the original endings on the DVD and Blu-ray as well, was a really, really wise one, giving a huge payoff for the movie at the end. And so the film would debut actually at the Toronto International Film Festival on the 9th of September 2013, ahead of a UK release on the 4th of October 2013. And the response to the movie, well, the critical response to it was really strong, actually. I mean, it was, first of all, a lot of praise for what Dexter Fletcher had managed to do, that he'd managed to mount this really impressive musical, but also the fact that the script, the story to it, had a lot more heart than you might expect from, again, what on the surface was something of a jukebox musical. I mean, 4-star ratings generally on the whole is what we were getting for the film, and there was a lot of commercial enthusiasm towards it. There was a feeling that this could be a bit of a minor hit movie, possibly a bigger hit movie, who knows. But it went into cinemas in the UK at the start of October 2013, and it was just not a good time to be in cinemas. This was a period where shows like The X Factor and Strictly Come Dancing in the UK were taking away a lot of Saturday night cinema viewings, and films weren't really quite hitting in the way that many distributors were hoping that they would. That said, Sunshine on Leith didn't have a terrible opening weekend. In fact, in the UK, it was up to second place by the time it got to second weekend, the weekend of the 11th to the 13th of October. But it's interesting what was around at that point. The Prisoners, the Denis Villeneuve film, had hit the number 1 spot, but it had been on release for a few weeks, that the other big opening movies weren't really clicking. The Fifth Estate had been expected to be a big hit based on the WikiLeaks story, but had opened in 6th place with £500,000. Sunshine on Leith second weekend, £732,000. Its gross at that point was up to £2.1 million. Blue Jasmine was around, Filth was around, Rush had done decent money, The Weekend was doing okay, but there was nothing really that was heavily breaking through. I should also point out that the weekend that Sunshine on Leith opened, well, it gave us what became known as George Mackay Day, because he had been busying himself on 3 movies, and it turned out 3 of those films opened on exactly the same day. I can't remember another time where this has happened to a single actor. The fact that he had the lead in 2 of them as well, all the more remarkable. So he was part of the ensemble for Sunshine on Leith, which was the highest performing of the 3. He also took the lead on For Those in Peril. He also had the lead in How I Live Now. And so George Mackay Day, for those who celebrate, October the 4th every year. As for Sunshine on Leith, its box office, once all was tallied up, was £4.1 million in the UK. It did get I think it got a very, very limited overseas release, but nothing really that pulled up any trees or anything. I mean, it barely made a scratch outside of the UK. It had an abundance of different distributors as well, and so it kind of made its way around the world, but very, very slowly and very, very sparsely. But still, the film, as the point of recording, is 11 years old, and I watched it ahead of this. Still very, very, very much stands up, and he's almost the overlooked film in Dexter Fletcher's directorial career. Off the back of Sunshine on Leith, he would continue his drive to just do things that he'd not done before, and that would lead him to Eddie the Eagle in 2015. That is a film I've covered previously on this podcast, and it is also an absolute treat. Which all brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, and let's face it, there's a sporting chance I have, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. I'm on Blue Sky at Simon Brew as well. Film Stories is on both services at Film Stories 2, and so, well, not Film Stories 2, Film Stories as well. Facebook.com/Film Stories online, YouTube.com/Film Stories, and then if you go to our store.filmstories.co.uk, you can find all of our print magazines, loads of print magazines. You can find subscription deals. You can find our Blu-rays for sale there. Filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, video games, TV, We are trying to build a clickbait-free entertainment website, which is much harder to do than you might think. Thank you to everyone who continues to support us there. And the Patreon, again, is patreon.com/SimonBrew. If you go to the Film Stories website, incidentally, and sign up for our newsletter there, we're putting some bits and bobs out on that too. But I think that's it, isn't it? Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate all the support of this podcast. I'm going off to watch more films. I'm going to go off and write more podcasts as well. Until the next time, you all take care. That's the most important thing. You all look after yourselves. That's important too. You all stay safe. I will be back soon with some more film stories. Bye-bye.